Hello, I'm Wick Scurry, and I want to do a abbreviated history of Daufuskie Island for people who visited in the lighthouse. This will loop, hopefully, and you'll be able to see it on video, on a little television. Uh, I want to start with the earliest history that we know about, and I want to preface anything that I say by saying this is history according to Wick Scurry. This is the way I was taught the history, and that's the way I'm going to tell it. Of course, the first people you have to start with, as far as history in America, period, are the Indians. And the Indians, if people ask, if you talk to somebody and you say, what were the Indians around Daufuskie or Hilton Head or the Low Country, because this is kind of history of more the Low Country than just Daufuskie. Everybody says that the Yamasee or the Yamacraw. And interestingly enough, those were not the Indians that were here when Spain arrived. As far as I know, the Indians that were here when Spain arrived were the Creek Indians. And the Creek Indians were a really interesting crowd because they were way over 6 feet tall, average over 6 feet tall. And you know, in those days, the Europeans were like 4'11" or 5 feet, you know, fairly small people. And these guys were huge, and so they named them whatever the Spanish word is for giant in Spanish. That's what the Spanish call them. Now, where the Yamasee come in is they were brought in when England started messing around in this area, and they were brought in by Spain, and they were a group of Indians that lived somewhere around the Savannah River. I'm sorry, the Mississippi River. And so these Indians were brought in by Spain and hired to do one thing: kill the English. You know, every morning, what do you want to do? Kill the English. And so a lot of the history includes the Yamasee because they were the group hired to kill the Indians by Spain. On the subject of the Indians, you have to talk about an amazing thing that's happened in South Carolina up the Savannah River. It's it's called the Topper Archaeological Site. But about 35 years ago, they started digging an area of the river. You know, these big mounds up there and so on. But what they found is a quarry of a certain kind of stone up there that's referred to as chirp. What the technical name for it is, I don't know, but it was ideal to make arrowheads, tomahawk heads, skinning tools out of. So get this, for 15,000 years, it was operated by Indians, and they were selling their wares as much as 1,000 miles away. And it's very distinctive. You can tell these heads when you see them, and people were traveling thousands of miles to come get them from this group of Indians. And over the years, there were different crowds of Indians. Some of the Indians were cannibalistic. They found human bones that were chewed on, for sure. When they found these gnawed human bones, showing that cannibalistic Indians, and by the way, when I say when they found, they would be the University of South Carolina's archaeological department, as well as some other universities, but it's primarily South Carolina doing the digging. They found these chewed bones and knew that somebody was eating people there. And I think this is just so human. They send out these newsletters about what they found, and they decided that whoever was eating people at that site, maybe 1,000 years ago, whatever it was, were probably from the Bahamas, and had come up from the Bahamas to eat people, which is so ridiculous. I mean, they just didn't want to say that there were cannibals that were ever lived in South Carolina, in my opinion. But anyway, there were cannibals living there, and the cannibalistic Indians were obviously making these arrowheads along with, over the period of time, many other tribes. Now, they started finding human bones and carbon dating the bones, and the bones went from 9,000 years, then they went to 11,000 years, then they went to 14,000 years, which, by the way, is as old as they thought mankind had been on Earth. About 3 or 4 years ago, they found a campfire with some arrowheads around it and some other things. Was carbon dated, you know, the stones and the bones that they found, and they found out that they were 50,000 years old according to carbon dating. Now that just sent everybody up, because that means the center of life was not Mesopotamia, you know, or where they had said it was for years and years. So it's still being argued, but they did find it. Spain was the first, I call them developers. You know, they're trying to develop America. And Spain was certainly the first that in any real force that came to this area. And, you know, Spain made a big mistake here in South Carolina. And that's why we're sitting on Daufuskie speaking English right now. What they did is they had two different things going on. One was St. Helena here near Paris Island, on Paris Island, over in Beaufort. There's a great museum over there. You can check all that out. But the other was another force, which was, you know, DeSoto. DeSoto was coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, and in search of, you know, as the Spanish always were, in search of mystical places that would give them longer life or more virility or whatever. And they ended up discovering a beautiful city along the Savannah River, and it was written in the archives in Spain about the city. All the buildings were octagonal. Some of them were 3 stories high. They estimated 25,000 people living in the city. And there was a queen or princess or whatever you want to call her that ran the city. Now, DeSoto and his men were on the Savannah side, and this beautiful, beautiful woman gets in is carried down to the river in a litter, kind of like they carried pharaohs around in, and you know, covered with bear skin, and then they put her in a barge and poled her across the river to where DeSoto and 7 or 8 guys conquistadors and a couple of priests were over there. When she goes up the bank on the other side, she carried a present to DeSoto. And by the way, all she had on was a black bearskin, nothing under it. And every one of the conquistadors talked about how absolutely beautiful she was and all of that stuff. And so anyway, she gives DeSoto a present of 126 pounds of pearls or something like that. This huge amount of pearls as a gift. And what DeSoto did for whatever reason is he burned the city and took her hostage. 3 days later, she escaped. So the word spread very quickly in South Carolina, and it affected everything in this area as well, you know. And all of the Indians hated Europeans. You know, they had killed their queen or princess or whatever she was. They hated them. And they started attacking these Indians left and right. Spain just got tired of fighting them. They would never have left South Carolina. You know, there was tons of gold. There's more gold in South Carolina than any other state in North America. Of course, it wasn't a state then. But anyway, Spain would never have left, but the Indians ran them off. So, interestingly enough, on Daufuskie was the last island to be occupied by Spain, and Spain went across the river, the Savannah River, and at that point occupied Georgia. So this whole thing we're talking about, that's when Spain brought in the Yamasee Indians and to kill the English, and the English took over South Carolina. And Daufuskie Island was the last sea island to be developed into plantations because of all that. And there were at least 2 forts down here at Bloody Point where we are today. So Spain had an interesting way of developing or taking over the world or whatever it was they were trying to do. The way they did it is very practical. They would bring in, how y'all? All right. Spain would bring in soldiers and build a fort, and they would, now think about these soldiers they're bringing in, right? The soldiers are 2 months away by ship from Europe, would probably serve at least 5 or 10 years over here. So they would, you know, obviously these are young men, so they would encourage the young men, the young soldiers, to marry into the Indians. And because they were interesting and different, I'm sure the young Indians married them very quickly. And then what would happen is they would, of course, have children, and they would make Catholics out of the children, the half-breed children. It worked really well, and look at Mexico, look at South America, look at everywhere else Spain was. It worked great. You know, everybody, you can't tell what they are. Are they Indian? Are they Spanish? What are they? They're a mixed breed, and they're Spanish, but most of all, they are Catholic. So it didn't work here because of DeSoto's mistake, but it worked everywhere else. Mexico, South America, and so on. When King Charles happened to be the King of England when all this was going on, which would have been in the 1600s, he always had his eye on South Carolina because he knew it was wealthy. England wanted to come, because uh, South Carolina had a lot of natural resources and so on. And it happened that King Charles was the king of England at the time. Spain had left and gone down to St. Augustine where the Indians liked them. And so England decides to come in. And King Charles was having a revolution over there and almost got his head cut off. And when King Charles decided to settle South Carolina was right after the Revolution, and 7 people had stepped up and saved King Charles's life. He would have had his head cut off or whatever they did to him. But 7 people from the blue bloods of all blue bloods in England were given South Carolina by King Charles. And King Charles gave 7 people South Carolina and part of North Carolina. They drew up a constitution that is still alive today in the South Carolina's Constitution. Parts of it are still in there. And so when England came over, it made South Carolina a totally different kind of colony than any other colony. Because it was not settled by people trying to get away from religious persecution or people that were out of debtors' prisons, like part of Savannah was settled. But, it was settled by very, very wealthy people to begin with. And those very wealthy people brought over indentured servants. And if you don't know this, indentured servants were the most talented people in England. They just didn't happen to be of the upper crust, but they were the best silversmiths, they were the best carpenters. Because why else would you bring them over here and feed them for 7 years and all of that? So these high-stepping English people who came from the aristocracy of England planted indigo on these sea islands primarily, and out of indigo they made a blue dye, and they became known as the blue bloods of the new country, and could trace their lineage back to the aristocracies of England. That's where the word blue blood comes from. At least that's the way we tell it, and I believe it to be true. So anyway, these people did well growing indigo, and about 15 miles inland, just by happenstance, a ship sailed into Charleston about the same time all this was going on. It had been in a hurricane, and the town of Charleston, one guy in particular, helped these people, and they were from Madagascar. So they were paid in cottonseed, right? I don't know how many bags of cottonseed, but it was on the ship. And within 50 years of that ship coming into Charleston, they planted cotton everywhere. And South Carolina, the low country of South Carolina was made, I'm sorry, I said cotton. I mean rice. We're not talking about cotton yet. This is rice, bags of rice. And the interesting thing about the rice was in 50 years, um, rice was the largest export of anything from America to Europe. And it became known as Carolina gold rice. And so you had indigo down here, you had Carolina gold rice inland. Then, of course, they grew corn and other stuff too, but the money makers were indigo and Carolina gold rice. Then I like to say all hell broke loose, you know. Somebody came along around 1800 and planted cotton. And when they planted cotton, it changed, I believe it completely changed the world, or this part of the world, because it was like so much money in it that no one could even conceive of it. You know, it it was Egyptian cotton, by the way, and it was called. They tried to. It's like a Vidalia onion. You ever heard of a Vidalia onion? Well, they tried to. Vidalia tried to say you could only grow Vidalia onions in Vidalia. Pretty tough to do, but they tried that with Sea Island cotton. Said if it didn't come from these islands, and the Sea Islands very quickly just go up. You've got Daufuskie, Hilton Head, St. Helena's. You've got Edisto, and then going the other way, all the way to the Georgia Sea Islands, which were growing the same thing. You've got Tybee, Warsaw, Blackbeard, Sapelo, St. Catherine's, and Cumberland. And I probably left, Blackbeard is one of them as well. But anyway, everybody moved. Said if you could grow cotton, you grew cotton. The only place you didn't grow cotton was in the rice fields, because you couldn't grow it in the rice fields. And cotton literally spread in 40 years from here all the way to Texas. Think about that. And I was in Natchez, Mississippi about 8 or 10 years ago, and the homes that were built with cotton money down there, you just have to see to believe. And so basically, everybody became little miniature, not even miniature, little Bill Gateses, right? I mean, they were so damn rich they had no idea what to do with the money. But the one thing about cotton is you needed labor. Labor was for sale in Sierra Leone, so they rushed out to buy slaves. And that kicked off the real abolitionist movement and this rift. It was all cotton between the North and the South. And I don't think there's any question in my mind, anyway, that cotton caused the Civil War. As we move through history up to the Civil War, I'm not going to dwell on the Civil War too long, but only to say that the Sea Islands had a tremendous play in the Civil War, because somebody up north knew that it wouldn't be a short war. All my life people would say, nobody thought the Civil War was going to last but a couple of weeks. Well, somebody up north knew better, because the first thing they did, the first year of the war, they came down and they took all the Sea Islands, all the way from Charleston south all the way to the border of Florida, and they set up blockades. There was one major battle in the Port Royal Sound on the other side of Hilton Head, and they had when they did that, it was, I believe, checkmate, because no cotton could get out at all, and no supplies could get in. And all they had to do, it was so simple. These were the blockades that choked the South to death. I mean, you had ships blockading harbors, but this was the real deal. They block these islands, block off everything, the inland to the ocean. So all you got to do is put cannons on either side of these sea islands and shoot the ships down that try to come in or go out. So no cotton could go out for sale, and no gear or no supplies could come in. And Sherman made it quicker when he burned the South, marched through and burned the South. But it was really, to me, checkmate, nail in the cross when that happened.
And flip your little shirt down real quick. The wind blew it up. Just push that to the bottom. Yeah, right there. It just flew up on you.
Okay, we'd finish all I need to talk about the Civil War. When the Civil War came to an end, some of the wealthiest plantations were left, almost all the wealthy plantations were left destitute, owned by carpetbaggers or whatever. And I want to, just for a brief moment, thank the North, which I don't do very often. But when all this land after the Civil War came up for sale, you had three buyers. One was the broke plantation owner. A few put their money in gold and were able to hold on to their property, very few. Secondly, you had the federal government. The federal government had decided they would buy the plantations on the sea islands, divide them up into 40 acres, and give them to the black population, freed slaves. What do you do with them? Give them a way to make a living. So they divided it up into 40-acre pieces on the property they got. And then the rest of the property ended up in the hands of northern families who had absolutely paid nothing for the property. And since they paid nothing for it, they didn't have to do anything with it. And it had, they controlled the courthouses in the early days, and so they had no real tax. So the land, the reason I say you got to thank the North a little bit is when you just ride around and you look at all the land that is just beautiful and almost untouched. It was because so much land was bought by the North and used for hunting and all kinds of stuff. So they inadvertently kind of put it in a conservation easement. A whole book could be written on the northern crazy people that moved to the South, by the way. A whole book needs to be written about it, because these were wealthy northern families that bought all this land down here, and they would get the wild kid to get rid of him. They'd send him down to the South, and they were really kind of interesting people. They were wild as hell. They loved to shoot guns and they loved to hunt, and they would, take them out of the attic up north and send them to the South to live in the old plantation house if it wasn't burned that was on the property. One person in mind that really tells the story of that is a guy named Harry Cram here, who lived on Devil's Island and was a crazy guy and very colorful, is my whole point. But anyway, enough said about that. when when um, when this period, 1870s, 1880s, Reconstruction, and all of that, uh, there were actually, when the Civil War came to an end, there was either one or two black people living on this island, where there had been thousands and thousands, or certainly over 1,000 prior to the Civil War. But they gave the land out, about a third of the island out to the black population, and this really was with every sea island for the most part, and they gave it out to the blacks in that 40 acres and a mule deal, and they came out here, and guess what? You could not farm 40 acres and make a living. You couldn't do it. And so they started kind of, the ones that stayed, well, first of all, here, the oyster industry came along around 1900, and there were 7 oyster factories, and there were 2,000 black people living on Daufuskie. And they made I don't know how much money they made, but they had a good living. And when they were done with the oyster industry, let me back up. What happened with the oyster industry is that Savannah, Georgia, and this is in the 1940s, late 40s, began to get industry into town. And they polluted the Savannah River, and through the pollution in the Savannah River, it flowed through the estuaries into the oyster beds of Daufuskie, and everybody on Daufuskie, the only way they had to make a living that paid them decent money was the oyster industry, and that ended. And so they left. When I moved out to Daufuskie the first time in the 1960s, I came to Daufuskie, and then we brought property out here in the 70s, and there were about 100 or so black people, descendants from the oyster industry people. Everybody else had to leave. They went to New York, Philadelphia, where they could go to make a living. And now most of those 100 people that I knew as a young man are gone. And now it's kind of sad. It is real sad, really. But a few people, moved to New York or Philadelphia, wherever they could go to make a living, when the oyster industry failed, have tried to come back, and some successfully and some not so successfully. But, that's a part of the history that's pretty well gone. And, that refers to what they now refer to as Gullah, which are the people who were stranded on these islands and spoke a real interesting dialect that's very hard to understand. And it's real pretty to listen to. But for the most part, they were kind of ashamed of the accent, for a long time. And so anyway, they lived a great life, though. They fished. They made corn liquor and rode it to Savannah and sold it. And I'm speaking of the ones that stayed and didn't leave. You had, a couple of ways to make a living. One was to catch crab and sell the crab in devil crab to yachts going to the north, and the men made corn liquor, when they would take their corn liquor to Savannah, row it to Savannah in the early days, about outboard later, they would run into revenue offices, and the revenue officer would look in the boat, and the boat had a bunch of scrap iron in it on top of vats of liquor. They couldn't see the vats of liquor, and they would tell the revenue people they were taking scrap iron to Savannah to sell to feed the family. They told the lie so much that liquor became scrap iron. And that's why Freeport Marina has a drink named scrap iron. And I will warn you, don't drink more than one or two of those. The rest is development came. Some worked, some didn't. Daufuskie, believe it or not, is pretty damn popular right now. And people love to get their boats and come over here and see the island and see the way it used to be. It's kind of the one place that is like it used to be, 50 years ago. And there's very little left around like that. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.